Hello, 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 and welcome to this very special edition of the Jolly Heretic on Tour. I don't know if you can see this. I am in a studio. I'm in a professional studio. There's lights shining at me. There's all kinds of very, very bright lights and black walls and padding and all of this strange stuff. And it's all very, very. I'm completely new to it, so forgive me if I'm too informal or too formal or whatever it happens to be. And also in this studio, over there in that direction, is Simon Webb of History Debunked, who you may recall I interviewed on my channel a while ago and of whom I'm a big fan. And I was vlogging earlier in the street here in Barnes, and I just happened to run into him, and there he was, and he was coming here. So we're both a bit early, so we thought we'd get on with it. So you should. I hope most of you are familiar with Simon Webb, History Debunked. If you're not, you're going to meet him today. So Simon, hello.
Hello there.
How do you do?
Fine, and you?
I'm okay. It's a pleasure to meet you at last. What do you think of these surroundings? They're a bit different from where you normally film, aren't they?
Yes, they're very modern, I suppose, is the word I'm looking for.
They're very modern, and there's cress behind you. I mean, I didn't know. You see that? I mean, I don't know what is that. I don't know if that's real cress.
No, it's plastic.
It's plastic cress.
It is.
So plastic cress is something that you need for one of these modern studios that the Generation Z people have. I don't know how to go on from plastic crest to segue from plastic crest to what I'm about to say, so I'll just go for it. So, Simon, you've just reached a boundary with your subscriber count, a significant a string of zeros.
Yes.
And why is it, do you think, that people so much like to hear, in your own words, an old man sitting there just talking about how it is?
I think there's probably two reasons for that. The first is that I talk about things that very few people do talk about openly now. I talk about the sort of things that people will talk about generally when they meet. They move their heads closer together like that, and they lower their voice because they don't want to be overheard in case they're accused of racism or something. And a lot of what I say is what people think but don't like to say. And the other reason is that there's no censorship at all on the channel I run. There's no moderation. I don't block anybody. I've never delete videos. I've never delete comments. Anybody can come on there and say whatever they please, and that's that.
So what are these kinds of issues then that you feel that you've noticed over the last, I don't know, 20 years or so, people have to put their heads together and be careful about?
Obviously, immigration is one, although people are talking more openly these days about the disadvantages and supposed benefits of immigration. But for a long time, anybody that mentioned immigration would cause raised eyebrows, as though a person must surely be a covert racist. Sexuality is another. There's quite a few things that people just don't like to speak about out loud.
Why do you think? Why is that? I mean, why? Because we used to, if you go back to the 60s or whatever, people. I don't remember that. You do.
I do.
You do. People were talking quite openly about it. So let's say immigration and sexuality slightly separate, that as well. And you look at a Monty Python sketch from the late 60s, and they did the mouse problem. And it very much reflected public attitudes towards homosexuality, which is, this is appalling. And you have people saying things like, well, it's not their fault or nothing. I mean, they're not hurting anybody, so I'll kill them. and now it's we have a vicar saying, I would insert crows into their bodies until the beaks stuck out through the stomach walls. And this was far. So why has it changed, do you think? Why can't we now talk about these issues?
Because at one time people used to speak in the most unpleasant way about homosexuality and about immigration. People would use derogatory terms about black people, and people would say very unpleasant things about Jews and immigrants, and there was a reaction. It became seen as unacceptable. But rather than just that being unacceptable, which I agree entirely that it should be, we should set a watch upon what we say, the whole topic became unacceptable. So it was an extension. First of all, it became unacceptable to use certain words and to say certain things, and then simply mentioning the topic itself. It was almost like a mission creep, you might call it.
So is that a process that often occurs with things in your experience, that they start off saying, okay, we can't say the word, whatever, the racist word, and then from there it's just that now Fiona Bruce was criticised the other day for referring
that black guy.
What's wrong with that? I mean, if someone said to me, if I was in Zimbabwe in an audience and someone said that white guy,
it wouldn't matter at all to me. And I'd say, Indian guy, black guy. But yes, she got into a lot of trouble for it. Even reference now to skin colour is seen as unacceptable.
But yet, on the other hand, they know perfectly well. You see sometimes adverts saying we need more Asian organ donors.
Sure.
We need more black organ donors because your body is less likely to reject an organ if you are of the same race as the donor. So there's this weird sort of schizophrenic attitude where on the one hand, as you say, race doesn't exist, it's not real, you can't talk about it. But on the other hand, if you don't talk about it and don't accept it exists, then basically people can die.
Yeah, I agree entirely. But other people set the parameters for what can and can't be mentioned. So a lot of people now have a subconscious feeling. They almost operate antennae. They listen around and work out what it is they can and can't say. And generally speaking, they wait until they see supposedly respectable people and how they're speaking about a topic, and then they copy that.
I was thinking, that gets me thinking, actually, obviously your area, history debunked, and finding areas of history that are misunderstood and sort of getting beneath it and finding the reality, which is what history is all about. What you're saying there, presumably was that always the case, that social antennae, that way of censoring your speech and thoughts?
Not quite to the extent that we have it now, I don't think. No, the modern era, it's more like McCarthyism. It's a case where people are careful about what they say. They are nervous about speaking because they know they can lose their job or their reputation will be trashed. So it's a little more extreme than it once was.
Well, I suppose I was thinking with regard to what? So I happened to read recently for something I was researching, a biography of Sir Cyril Smith, who was, by all accounts, an appalling man. But one of the things that was noted in that is that when he was a child in Rochdale in the 30s, him and his sister would have trouble being served in certain shops because they were known to be illegitimate and from a single mother, and it was almost as if it was felt that the moral background from which they were born was so repellent that you could almost like catch something by interacting with them. And then from there, after the war, you started this process of, if a woman gets pregnant, who's unmarried, of course the child must be taken away from her. It's almost like she's polluted. So isn't that sort of, your reputation of the family is trashed, you must have the child adopted, if you don't, we're nothing, we're nobody. Isn't that a sort of a parallel, perhaps?
It is, but there's also a religious aspect. The whole business about illegitimacy is based on the Bible. You know, that illegitimate children weren't allowed to join the congregation of the Lord in the Old Testament. That's where the slur on illegitimacy began. Yeah, but if you go back to the mid-19th century, you find that women will have these illegitimate children, and it'll say in the parish records, base-born child of Sarah Craft or whatever, and they don't give them away. They're just brought up illegitimate. So it's almost as if across the 19th century and into the 20th century, and even after the war, what you talk about, the creep earlier, it's almost as if it became more unacceptable to be illegitimate. Is that fair? Yes, I think it is. Yes, it wasn't respectable. It was something to be ashamed of. So respectable people got rid of it, and the easiest way is to get rid of the child, to dispose of the kid, have it adopted or sent somewhere.
But you think people are becoming sort of less religious across time? If you look at across the 19th century, church attendance starts to go down. But yet at the same time, you have this interesting thing that they're becoming more extreme, more intolerant.
I think that's true.
What was that about, do you think?
I wouldn't like to speculate what causes that, but yes, you're quite right. It's definitely a thing.
Yeah, but it's good to get behind these things, I think. But what was it though that? So going back to your channel though, so yeah, you've crossed this border, this string of zeros. You've said why it is you think people like it. What was it that encouraged you to set it up in the first place? I mean, we have in your own words an old man writing lots and lots of history books, so many books that you've lost count.
I have,
and it's made more complicated by the fact there's another Simon Webb that writes books, and you have
Yes, indeed. The other Simon Webb that writes books on religious subjects. I've had difficulty with that for some time. A television station contacted me a while ago I thought they wanted to speak to me about my books, and they were lining up an interview. And then they asked me about a particular book, and I had to break it to them that I hadn't written any books at all about Quakers or saints. And they were quite, I mean, I probably could have bluffed my way through the interview. It's happened also, the same fellow has written a book about slavery, and that's called,
Oh, is that right?
Oh, yes, oh, indeed so. And that's caused immense confusion.
Do you remember what his book's called?
No, but it's about slavery, I know that much. And it came out roughly the same time one of my books on slavery came out.
Ah, I wonder if I've accidentally read it, thinking it was by you. I think I might have done, because I remember noting that there was another. I thought to myself, oh, he's written 2 books on slavery. Oh, okay. Well, he's obviously got into it a lot of depth. He's obviously really interested in it. Oh, right. Okay. The white slave trade one, that's you.
That's me. That's
you.
me. Okay.
Yes. That's you. All right. Okay. I know I said that. Well, good. I didn't waste my time then with that one. That's good. So, what was it? So you were writing all these books. Where did you first start writing history books?
I've done a lot of writing over the years for magazines, newspapers, and so on. I used to have a column in True Detective. I don't know, do you ever see True Detective magazine?
I know the kind of magazines you mean, going back to the 90s and whatever.
That's right. Yes, I used to write for True Detective. I used to write on occult subjects for Prediction, a magazine called Prediction, and it specialises in supernatural and occult things. I used to do stuff for them. So it was a natural process, really, to start writing books as well.
But how did you then move on to the idea of having of a YouTube channel?
The son of a old school friend he was studying to be a filmmaker, and he wanted to use me to produce some films. He wanted to set up a camera with me to do films based upon my ideas, and we did half a dozen. If you look at my channel, the very first ones are very professionally done. You know, they're all intercut with clips of film and all the rest of it. And then after that,
when was this?
Oh, 4 or 5 years ago.
All right.
And after that finished, it didn't really amount to anything. So I thought I'd just start making, films myself, just speaking directly to camera.
Mm-hmm. And how quickly did you notice that people started to sort of get in touch with you or email you? Or?
Fairly quickly, because I have a website and people know me anyway from the books that I've written. So yeah, that took off fairly fast once I started making things on my own account.
And did you find that then doing this inspired new ideas for books? And
yes, absolutely, yes. Yes, there was a certain amount of feedback that inspired the books, and the books inspired ideas for talks. So yes.
Which was the first book of yours that was inspired basically by YouTube interaction? And
probably the second book on slavery, the African slave trade, because I realised that there was an appetite there. People wanted to know about slavery in Africa.
Yeah, and then from there, it's this back and forth, symbiotic.
That's right.
Process.
Yes.
And so, but going back, then I suppose I just to go back. I read the book of yours recently. I intermixed them in my mind, but we were talking about it earlier. The best years of their lives.
Yes.
And then you've written 60s these books about the before time, the long ago. When England was so different. So could you tell me a bit about where were you? When did you start out in life?
I was born in Custom House down by the docks, and then we lived in Bethnal Green, and then in my later childhood in Ilford.
What did your father do?
Oh, my father just clerical work. His father was a blacksmith, so it was a very working class family.
And then they sort of they got a bit of money together and moved into. Was Ilford less unpleasant in those days?
It was dull and respectable. It was a step up from Bethnal Green, but it was a very respectable. It was actually Seven Kings, which is on the edge of Ilford. It was a working class, dull sort of area.
And as people, as you've wrote about one of your books, they kind of romanticise this time. When are we talking the 50s or whatever? They romanticise this time. Oh, let's get back to those values. What was your? Can you tell me a bit about childhood in the East End? I mean, was it something to be romanticised? Or?
No, I found it very dull because nothing much happened. When I was growing up in Ilford, it was all grey. It's dull. My memories of the 1950s are not that it was some wonderful era. There was nothing much to do. We didn't have a television. We just had a wireless, Bakelite wireless, and it was uninteresting. It was boring.
How old were you when you got a TV?
I don't know.
What year?
9 or 10, sometime in the 60s.
Oh, was that normal then?
Not everyone we knew had televisions. We take a lot of these things for granted. It was only in 1975 that half the people in this country had telephones. Until 1975, the majority of people in Britain didn't have access to a telephone.
Yeah, I know. Well, I know that my dad's family, but his father was an engineer, and they always had a telly, always. And indeed, my granddad built a functioning telly from scratch because he wanted to watch the coronation.
Sure.
But then my mum, she was brought up as a council estate, but they always had a telly. But maybe I think she told me that my grandfather absolutely wanted a TV. He thought it was a brilliant idea, and he absolutely wanted to. They always had a TV. I didn't know that it was. There were quite a few people of that kind of age.
There were quite a few people that didn't. I think we take a lot of these things almost as a background for granted. We take sort of telecommunications, having television, having telephones, and it's almost like a basic thing. It's a necessity of life. But certainly when I was growing up, the first question you'd ask someone if you met them is, "Are you on the telephone?" Which today it sounds like asking, "Do you have a horse and cart or something?" It sounds absolutely preposterous.
Well, I know that if you watch old clips of old game shows, TV shows like was it Stars in Their Eyes?
Yeah.
In the 70s, and you would vote for the star you wanted via postcard.
That's right. Yes.
And I thought to myself, well, why would they do that? And you're rather making sense of it. If only half the population.
Yeah.
And was it ITV?
Yeah.
So that's the sort of was seen as the light channel, the workers' channel.
Right, yes.
So presumably those people were even less likely to have telephones.
That's right. Yes.
Wow. So
You've got to remember also that, I mean, getting a telephone was a big problem. You had to book it months in advance. You had to go to an office and be interviewed. Telephones.
why did you have to be interviewed for?
To get a telephone. It was a state enterprise, like being in the Soviet Union. You had to go to an office and speak to somebody there and apply to have a telephone.
Oh, I see.
And there was a big waiting list. All things like gas and electricity and telephones were state monopolies. You couldn't just buy a gas cooker. You had to go to a government-run agency, a special place to buy a government authorised gas cooker.
I did not know this.
It was after the Labour Party came in the late 1940s. They nationalised everything like gas, electricity, and so on. So these were state monopolies. It was very much.
I knew that, but I didn't know you had. I thought you got to get a cooker. You go to a shop, you buy a cooker.
No, you had to do it to a government agency.
What if electricity? Same.
Electricity, the same. Yeah, you couldn't just go off and buy an electric cooker or a gas cooker. You had to go to a special place, run by the electricity board or the gas board.
I did not know that.
Oh, yeah.
Well, these are the kind of things that get lost, though. They get the information just gets lost and forgotten, and then you're reading back on things in history or what, and it just doesn't make sense anymore because you've forgotten that information. So, for example, when I told my kids about life before the internet, they don't understand that there was an infrastructure there. It's not that bad. So you had things like frequent post.
Sure.
You had concepts like stamped addressed envelopes.
Yeah.
You had even telegrams. If you go back to the early 80s, when did they get rid of telegrams? I don't know when it was. So there were things to make communication slightly easier.
That's right. Yeah.
Which it wasn't just like we jumped. But that's extraordinary. I did not know that. But bloody hell. But going back to your childhood, so you brought up in the Custom House. Bethnal Green, around there,
sure.
East End. You talked in one of your books about how violent life was on the streets for kids in those days. Was there any element of kids carrying knives? Was there any element of that?
Every child carried a knife. I mean, I don't know a boy that didn't carry a knife when I was young. Pen knives. If you went on a school outing to a cathedral or a castle, the first thing you would do in the souvenir shop would be to buy a knife. Pen knives with pictures of the cathedral on them. Everyone carried knives, but they weren't used for stabbing people.
Well, what they do with them?
Well, for example, you use them for carving things. You could carve your initials in trees. You could whittle a stick. There's a load of things you could do.
There was this game you were talking about in your book, though. What the kids have to chuck a knife?
Doing the splits, yeah. Yeah, that's right. You would stand and you'd throw your penknife and it would stick in, and then the person had to put their foot on that spot. And there were loads of games like that.
And you could get seriously injured, presumably.
Yeah, of course, yes. And especially the game where you bang the knife, increasingly rapidly round your fingers like that. That led to a few cuts.
So, but there wasn't, because you said in the book about how kids in some parts of the East End wouldn't move to another part because of sort of, even young kids, because of sort of localised gangs, and they'd be afraid of being...
Yeah, the equivalent of the postcode wars. Certainly people, say, from Stepney Green would go to Bethnal Green to fight, and if someone from Bethnal Green was spotted in an area in Stepney, it might lead to trouble. They might be attacked.
But you never had anything like that in your East End childhood?
No, I kept out of mischief.
What did you do then? How did you entertain yourself?
Reading.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, were you one of the sort of the boff type?
Yeah, one of the SWATs. Yes, I was always at the library.
Okay, and what kind of thing particularly fascinated you already when you were a child?
Everything. All non-fiction. Everything.
So okay. So were you in the situation of the 11 plus and all that sort of thing?
Yes, I took the 11 plus.
Did you pass it?
Oh yes.
Because you were quite critical of the 11 plus in your book.
Yes, it's a bit of a racket for the middle classes.
But yet you passed it.
Yeah, it worked to my advantage well enough. Yeah.
Well, because your parents were slightly more middle class.
No, my parents were at least a bit middle class. It's some.
Well, you
of
said
it,
your dad was a. What did you say?
He just worked in an office.
Yeah, but clerical in those days is a bit...
It was white. It was a white-collar job, which was a step up from his own family and a step up from my mother's family. My mother's father was a bus driver, and before that, a drayman. So it was a working-class family, but gradually they'd managed to advance a little to office work, which gave me a bit of a sort of a boost, I suppose, socially.
So some of these questions that you were highlighting, like... summarise Bleak House. Or
sure.
These were things you were at 11 that you were kind of more able to...
Yeah, because I read a lot.
You were able to do?
Yes.
So you went to grammar school.
I did.
Was this in Ilford, presumably?
Yes, that's right.
And then what... and you already... Was history your favourite subject when you were at school?
No, not really. No. I don't. My sort of past like that isn't a subject to be enlarged upon, really. It wasn't sort of a brilliant success. But fortunately, I went abroad when I was in my 20s, and that's where most of what I'm doing now is based upon.
Oh, really? Yeah. That's fascinating. Before I can just move back.
Yeah.
So when if you don't mind asking, so you at school? Did you do A levels?
I'd prefer not to discuss that aspect of my past for reason. It's a complicated story, but I would rather pass swiftly over those years between school and when I returned to this country.
Did you go to university?
As I say, I would like to pass over those. It's not a subject to be enlarged upon.
Well, why on earth not?
Well, we all have parts of our lives, I should think, that we would prefer to draw a veil over, shall we say?
Well, that's. I mean, I don't want to sort of labour the point, but I mean, it's what I would have assumed. I don't know, but I've published 20 books, and when I first published a book, you can't just turn up at which was religious studies on fundamentalist Christians. You can't just sort of turn up at a publisher and say. Okay, I've written this book called Meeting Jesus at University. It's about fundamentalist Christians and conversion experiences and stuff. What do you think? The first thing they want to know is, well, how are you qualified to write the book? So you have to say, as I did, I've got a theology degree, I've got a PhD in theology, I've published 3 papers that relate to the book.
You're talking about making a pitch to a publisher.
Pitch to a publisher. So
absolutely, yes.
Surely you'd have to say to them, I have a degree in history.
Not a bit of it. No. You can make a pitch to a publisher simply based upon the fact that you can write. So the fact that I've had my own column in magazines and the fact that I've done a lot of writing actually gave me a sufficient in anyway to publishing.
Okay. Well, okay, fine. So, all right. So basically, I'm assuming that you went to university, did a history degree, and took lots of drugs, and were arrested, or something like that. Who can tell? So, what then occurred in your? So, let's skip forward then. I'm assuming 22 years old. Let's say. What was it? You went abroad. What happened there?
I went to live in Israel.
Why?
Because it's the sort of thing people did in those days. A lot of people went to live in Israel because it's the only place that Marxism has really been successful.
You mean in the kibbutzes?
Yeah, in the kibbutzim, yeah, that's right, Marxist communities. And the one that I went to live on was very hardcore Marxist. there was no money. Children, when babies were born after the age of 6 months, they went to live in communal houses. They didn't live with the parents. So that lifestyle in the 70s was very interesting to a lot of people, to a lot of young people. It was practical experience of Marxism, but outside the Iron Curtain version of Marxism that you saw in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union.
So were you a committed Marxist in some way yourself at that age?
No, I was interested in Marxism, and I was interested in the idea of communal living. At that time, in the 70s, there were a lot of communes. People set up communes in London and other big cities where young people would live together, say, in a large house.
Yeah, that's right. I remember reading about the Birmingham, the Guildford Four.
That's right, they lived in a commune.
They lived in this commune.
That's right, in 74 they were living in a commune. Yeah, that's right. So the kibbutzim are something like that. There's something interesting from that point of view, the idea of communal life.
Yeah, and so you went and lived in one?
Yes.
And what were you sort of working on a farm or something like that at the same time?
Yeah, that's right. That was for about a year, and then there were various other things. I lived in Jerusalem.
What the bloody hell?
Who knows what that is?
I thought these professional studios were meant to have sort of silence.
Well, you see, they've got all the soundproofing.
They've got the soundproofing, but isn't that going to... I mean, that was like a train coming by.
It sounded like it, yeah.
What a bloody racket. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Maybe these tiles are purely ornamental.
We're in this padded cell here, chaps, and I assumed I would get silence, and then there was just the most, I don't know if you heard it, the most appalling racket, like we were right by a railway or something like that. We're a bit of a distance from Pounds Bridge. But all right, so you were working, picking melons or something, was it? Or what?
Yes, sort of working on farms, and then I've lived in Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip.
Gaza Strip, bloody hell. So what did anything interesting stuff appertain while you were there? This is when? This is the early 70s?
Yeah, well, yes, it's mid-70s. I was there in 78, but by that time I'd also travelled around Turkey and Syria and Lebanon and so on during the
this is extraordinary. You were very modest about it earlier, saying, my life's not that. But that's pretty interesting. So what kind of things did you find? Did you pick up on? You've said to me, you don't want to talk about whatever you did, a degree, whatever, and that this was what sort of sparked your interest in history and in...
Sure, absolutely.
So how did... Tell me, can you give me some examples of you were in Syria or you were in Turkey or you were in... and your interest was peaked?
Of course, absolutely, because when I first went to Israel, I spent a year on a kibbutz, and I went from there feeling very much in favour of the Israeli cause. But then later on, when I went around Syria and Jordan, I could see another side of the matter, and that sparked me to sort of look deeper into the question, because it's only when you look at both sides of a frontier that you can really understand something about what's going on. If you went to the Ukraine, you would pick up a particular point of view. You might become devoted to the Ukrainian cause. If you then visited Russia or visited the Donbass, Donetsk area in eastern Ukraine, you might pick up another perspective, and it might alter how you felt about Ukraine.
Like when Gulliver spends time with the big enders and then the little enders.
That's right, yes, precisely so.
Yeah,
exactly.
So you were with the big enders for a while,
and then I went to look and see what the little enders thought, and then I found my perceptions changing slightly and maturing.
I think that's an interesting thing, though. I don't know. I'm going off the topic a little bit, but that remark, and that's because I said that, and I thought to myself, well, it just came into my head, but also I just thought to myself, well, he'll have read Gulliver's Travels, or at least have seen the TV series, but probably read it, and I've read Gulliver's Travels, and you'd expect a reasonably educated Englishman to have read Gulliver's Travels. Yes. And that's the thing, with reference to what you're saying on a Travel Immigrate, it's things like that that are falling apart, common frames of reference.
I agree entirely. The common frame of reference at one time you could make... For example, I had dealings with a woman the other day, and she... down on the South Bank, there were bookstores.
That's right, yeah, I've seen under the bridge as well.
Absolutely. I bought a book there yesterday morning, and I handed it to the woman. She said, oh dear, I didn't get up until late today, so I'm a little bit confused, And I said, laughing, I said, go to the ant now, sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Now, that's a reference from the King James Bible, from the book of Proverbs, you probably catch immediately. Yeah. At one time, that would have been seen as being quite funny, but she looked at me blankly. She hadn't got the faintest idea and sort of, you know, as if I was some sort of madman quoting scripture. There's a lot of stuff like that from the Bible, a lot of, sort of quotations, a lot of references that have vanished completely now.
And they've leaked into the language often without people knowing that they're from the Bible.
Yes, that's right.
Particularly from the... God, what's his name? The guy that was burnt alive in Belgium, Tyndall.
Yeah.
Particularly from the Tyndall Bible. There's
Yeah.
the little reference, cut to the quick.
Sure.
You know, things like that. And there's these common frames of reference. That
Yeah.
I was saying to you before we started talking about when I was in Clacton, and this guy said a car swerved towards me. I had to get out of the way, and he said, crossed the road towards me. Chap said, "Oh, someone hasn't been reading the Green Cross Code." And I was like, oh, yeah. And it's it lubricates social interaction. It makes people feel they're part of something greater, as part of a whole, a part of a community. And if that goes, and it's going very fast, that we can't. It was so easy in the part make reference to the Bible or Greek myth or a corpus of literature. Then how you can't interact with people? It's a sort of a...
Well, we can't interact with people. That's a different thing from saying people can't interact with each other. We're speaking from a particular perspective. It says in Ecclesiastes, don't ask why things were so much better in the old days. It's not an intelligent question. We are saying, in effect, that it's all change and decay. We're saying that things have gone down because the references that are now coming aren't familiar to us. But talking to young people, they often come up with references from what they see as popular culture that I don't catch. So I think that it's not so much a case that there's no more culture or that there's no popular culture. It's different from what we are familiar with.
Yes, that's true. I know a lot of people that are increasingly surrounded, in fact, by people that are considerably younger than me, 10 years or more, even 20 years or more. And it's true. Now I think about talking to these people, they make some comment. What are you talking about? And it's an allusion to Strictly.
Absolutely.
It's some term. It's like going back to Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah.
It's like in, where is it? He goes one of the islands, and people can't die. And so they just live forever.
Sure.
And then eventually the elderly people are literally speaking a different language from the young people. They can't even communicate with them.
That's precisely what's happening now.
But it's happening so rapidly. I can't imagine that you would have a situation. Would you get that many situations, or is this just?
It's a complaint that's been regularly made. Old people, my grandparents used to make this complaint in the 1960s that things were changing so fast they couldn't keep up with it, because the 60s were a period of great change. There's a huge difference between, say, 1959 and 1970. That was a decade of change. The same thing happened after the First World War. There's been other occasions when it's happened.
I suppose the mid 2000s. Rapid change.
Yeah,
I know that the research indicates that the use of emotion words in representative corpuses of literature going up for a long time as rational words are going down, and then in about the year 2000, there's just this spike.
Yeah,
boom, which implies a massive cultural shift.
That's right.
And that's when the normal things would break down, so that the difference between 1949 and 1959 is nothing compared to the difference between 1959 and 1969.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Which, of course, you lived through and would have noticed.
Yeah.
But anyway, we were in 1978. So what were the things? Can you give us some examples, perhaps, of whether conversations with people or passing things that you noticed that made you think, once you in Israel, that made you really understand their point of view, but then in Syria you were, oh God, no, perhaps there's more to it.
Yes, of course, talking to Palestinians who had lived in Israel and were now exiled in Jordan, that certainly gave me pause for thought. Or getting to know, say, an Arab. When I was in Israel, it was mainly Jews I had dealings with, not so many Arabs. But of course, in Syria and Jordan, I had more dealings with Arabs, and the same thing in Lebanon. And getting to know Arabs and realising they were just like me, and hearing them talk patriotically about their own country. Mm. So that made a difference, because when you get to know people, you start to see them as human beings rather than an abstraction.
Did you see? So beforehand, though, when you turned up, were you already more sympathetic to the Israelis than to the Arabs?
Yes, definitely.
Because of what? Because of the news and the perspective we
No,
get?
because of my family. They were bloody mad for Zionism. It's a long story.
Well, hang on. You earlier, your family were they're working class, ordinary people that
Yes,
have become
indeed,
lower
yes.
middle class and they're a clerical
Yes,
worker.
yes,
Why
absolutely.
was such a relatively everyday? Oh my goodness me!
Oh, what a dreadful faux pas!
There's a dreadful faux pas.
Oh,
Cut. Yes. 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 Oh dear. I don't know what that's about. Private number. But don't know how they manifest. I should switch this off. Right. Okay. Cut, chaps. We're going to have to. It never occurred to me I would be rung during a.
I would say I don't have mobile telephones.
Do you not?
No, not a bit of it.
You don't have a mobile phone. How on earth do you function without a mobile phone?
Well, if I want to make a telephone call, I'll wait till I get home.
But the young people, they can't function without their mobile phones.
I'm not a young
I was once.
person.
You know how I got here?
Go on.
I got here on the. I discovered from the internet. Do you have that?
Oh,
You do have
yeah, I
that.
have
We know
the
you have that.
internet.
You have
Oh,
that from your channel. Fine. But we used to like you go somewhere and use it. But I discovered from the internet that I had to get a bus all the way from where up here, one single bus outside of rugby, and I had to get off by a rugby club. Now, once I got to the rugby club, it just said it's a mile's walk or 0.7 of a mile walk to here. And I thought, well, presumably I can just ask the rugby club, can't I? And I was correct, I could. So I went to the rugby club and asked. But that's not what the young people do. The young people have a thing where they put it into they have a map. It's called Google Maps.
That's right, yes,
and they put it into their
of
phone.
course.
And I was, and then they follow Google Maps. That's what they do.
Ah, but you see, I have an A to Z in my bag, which is even better.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. You know what I think happened there? I think it was probably some company from Finland trying to sell me something.
I wouldn't be at all surprised.
And because I answered in English,
it's through them.
it was like, mä en puhu hyvä englantia. Mä en halua puhua englanniksi. No niin, yo. And then just put the phone, I think, silence. I think that's what it was. Or it could have been the Secret Services, I suppose, but I think that's less likely. Talking to such a based and dangerous historian, maybe they're spying on what I'm doing. But anyway, so you saw the different perspective anyway.
Yes.
And then you were in Israel for a while, Israel and Turkey. Did you interact much with the Kurdish perspective in Turkey versus the Turkish one?
Yeah, but that's mainly in the east. That was around Lake Van. Well, when I was in Turkey, it was on the point of civil war. It was before, you probably know there was a military coup there in 1980.
Yeah.
But even before that, in 78, 79, there was a lot of shooting on the streets and a lot of bombing. It was falling apart. Those were the days when you had Suleiman Demirel of the Justice Party and Ecevit, the socialist, and they used to take it in turns. But, they both ended up being arrested by the military. They caused the country to collapse.
So you came back to England, about 1980?
No, ultimately, I came back here in 1982 to live.
So 78 to 82, you were...
No, more than that. I first went to Israel, I think, 76. So I was out of the country for 6, maybe 7 years.
And this was those countries, Middle East and whatever?
Yeah, and Sweden.
Oh, well, how did you end up in Sweden?
My first wife was Swedish.
How did you meet? Did you meet her on your travels?
No, I met her in Israel. She was a convert, Orthodox.
Convert to Orthodox Judaism?
Yes.
So she was a white, Swedish...
Swedish convert to Judaism, yes.
This is sounding complicated. Did you convert yourself?
No.
How did you get married?
Because we had a civil marriage in Sweden. It was a terribly complicated
because
business.
almost everybody, I don't know about now, but in those days, Sweden would have been, we're talking, the 70s?
Yeah.
Sweden was overwhelmingly Lutheran.
Yes, absolutely.
And like 90% or something. And to dissent from the Lutheran Church and their Svante culture was sort of almost a crime.
Sure, but there was a community of Jews there, Polish people, that had been thrown out after the pogroms in 1968. So there was a Jewish community in Sweden, and largely consisting of Polish exiles.
So you met her in there, and you went back to Sweden in what? Was it 70s, I suppose?
Yeah, married her, and then that fell to pieces, and I went back to the Middle East.
Well, it fell to pieces quite quickly.
Fairly quickly, yeah.
This is the tremendous cultural differences that exist between an English man and a Swedish woman. I mean,
no, not a bit of it. I mean, it was a very relaxed and very laid-back country in those days. No, I got on fine. young men are like that. Young men do, I wanted to get back where the action was. I didn't want to be in Europe.
So you went back to the Middle East?
Of course, yes.
And she didn't come back to the Middle East?
She did, no, she didn't, no.
She wanted to stay in Sweden. Where did you live in Sweden?
Gothenburg, Göteborg.
And this was before it was all Arabized?
Yes, absolutely.
And what were your observations about life in Sweden as an outsider?
But it was very laid back, very liberal. I mean, it was ethnically homogenous. But there were all sorts of things there that struck me as odd as an Englishman at that time. There would be advertisements at the cinema, say, for Tampax. Now, in those days, menstruation was quite a taboo in Britain. The idea of advertising tampons on television or the cinema in Britain at that time would have been unthinkable. And yet the Swedes had this relaxed attitude towards it. If you went to a beach, there'd be topless sunbathing. And again, you wouldn't have seen that in Britain in the 1970s. That would have been considered outrageous, a woman just, laying on the beach with her breasts bare.
No. Were there other things like that? I mean, did they treat each other differently the way we would?
It seemed more relaxed. It seemed that there wasn't, sexually they weren't as repressed as the English, or that's how it struck me then. It struck me as a very laid back and with it sort of society.
What were some examples apart from the nudity of them not being?
Oh, just generally, it was relaxed. England at that time was very, how can I put it? There was a lot of strikes, and the IRA were bombing places, and I don't know. Sweden just seemed a very relaxed and easygoing place.
Too relaxed for you?
Too relaxed for me. I wanted to see a bit of excitement.
So you went back to where?
I went, Amsterdam, and then I went overland from Denmark to Damascus first, via Greece and Turkey. I worked in Turkey on an irrigation project. And then I went to Beirut.
How did you get into an irrigation? Well, just labouring?
It was a political business.
A political business? What?
Yeah, going into the mountains to help people in a practical sense.
Right, okay, so sort of left-wing activism.
Yes.
That was what you were into?
It's what I did.
So but you weren't, at that stage, you wouldn't have said you were a Marxist.
I wasn't a Marxist, but, young people tend to be more left-wing than older people.
Yeah, sure.
It's one of those things. If I meet a conservative, a young man in his early 20s who's a conservative, I regard that as being quite odd. I regard that as being sort of slightly offbeat. Whereas if you meet a young man in his 20s who's a fervent Marxist or a communist, that seems to me quite natural. That's a natural way of things. And then when they get older, they become more reactionary, more conservative.
So what would be wrong? What kind of person do you think would be a conservative already when they were young? Would they have to be just?
I don't say there's anything wrong with it. I say it strikes me as slightly odd.
It is odd. But if it's odd, then it's almost it implies in a way there's something a bit abnormal.
I think it would be slightly abnormal to meet a young man in his early 20s who is a devout conservative. I know it happens. But I think most young people tend to be more rebellious. Most young people it's a natural thing. Youth is rebellious and the old people are reactionary.
But I suppose, Simon, if you think about it, when you were at school, even when I was at school, when I started school, 85 I started school, some of the teachers were born in the 1920s.
Sure.
These were the traditional church ladies. My headmistress was a spinster Church of England type.
Yeah.
And so then you're at the fag end, really, of the group society, of the pre-equality harm avoidance, the pre-leftist, the original society.
Sure.
And so how do you rebel? Well, you rebel by saying, "Oh, I'm left wing. I'm an atheist. I'm going to have my tie undone. I'm going to be I'm going to say the traditional rude words, the big two.
Yeah.
And that's how I'm going to rebel. Whereas now, if someone's born in 20 years after me, the year 2000, they've got some woman teacher who was born in 1980 or something, or a bit later, with purple hair and tattoos, and she's telling them that that it's wrong to criticise homosexuality, it's wrong to talk about immigration, it's wrong to talk about race, transsexuality is a good and proper thing, that men are women and women are men, cut your bits off and be proud.
Accept
your own destruction. So shouldn't the rebellion now be to be right-wing?
No, the rebellion is things like changing sex, because you're right, you've got the generation, the lefty teachers, that grew up during the 70s and 80s, and they're all in favour of homosexuality and they're all in favour of immigration. But they were taken aback quite sharply when they realised that young people were changing sex and wanted to mutilate their bodies. That was a rebellion in a sense. It's mainly driven by young women now. It used to be anorexia, it used to be self-harming, mutilating themselves, cutting themselves. Now it's having a double mastectomy. And a lot of the generation, those 70s generation of teachers, do find that puzzling.
Yeah, the 70s generation of teachers do. So that is in that way. But then on the other hand, couldn't you counter argue that what they're doing is taking the acceptable body of values, which is, let's say in this sense, let's go back to the 80s. One thing you could do to rebel, the main thing you'd do to rebel, would be, I'm an atheist, I'm a left wing, or whatever, fine. But another thing you could do is take the acceptable body of values, either right wing values, and shock them by taking those in an even more extreme direction. And perhaps that's what was happening when we were talking earlier about illegitimacy becoming more unacceptable across the 50s, 60s, 70s. Perhaps actually what you're seeing there is the parallel. You're seeing a conservative society in which the reaction of some, perhaps younger people, is to say, I am even purer. I am even purer than the younger generation. I would never have a legitimate child. A legitimate child must be adopted. Perhaps that's the parallel with what they're doing. These younger people with the transsexual thing, they're taking what is the dominant, accepted power reflecting. You want to get power in the 50s or 40s. You want to get your Machiavellian. You want power. You don't go around saying I want to be left wing. You go around saying I'm so pure morally that I'm saying that kids that are bastards should be put into care. Is that not it?
Yes, but we're seeing something like that now. A lot of young people today are very puritanical.
That's what exactly
they really are.
But they're puritanical in the direction of even more gay, even more trans.
Yes, but they're not being even more right-wing politically. You see young people now, there's certainly a very strong puritanical streak, which is a reaction to their parents. I used to be a heavy drinker. My daughter is practically teetotal.
When you say heavy drinker, was that like by Swedish standards or by English?
No, by any normal standards. It's why I'm a teetotaler now.
Right.
But a lot of young people, when I was a young man, the meeting place was the pub. You would meet in the pub. People would smoke openly in the streets. Young people now are utterly opposed to drinking too much alcohol. A quarter of young people now are teetotalers. Whereas, say 50 years ago, that would have been a really freakish thing to meet someone that was completely teetotal. Young people's rebellion now is in being teetotal. It's not smoking. It's not eating meat. It's living being very healthy and being...
Well, I suppose that makes sense. In my own generation and people born 10 years before me, of course, you had this absolute... university culture of hedonism, of the idea that it was absolutely shameful, let's say, to turn up at university and to have not had sex yet.
Yeah,
you of course had to. You lose your virginity as quickly as possible. Yeah. You had to absolutely drink, experiment with drugs.
Yes.
This total culture of hedonism.
Yeah.
So you have a reaction against that. I wonder if there is a reaction against. So if there's two kinds of reaction. One is as you say, the puritanical reaction that you're seeing, but also part of that as well with those kinds of people. They're socially anxious. They're the new church ladies. They take the in thing and make it even more extreme. But there was some research that indicated that people who are 40 are normally predictably more left-wing, like you can measure it, than people that are 20.
Sure.
And that's breaking down. Of course, people that are 20 are super left-wing, but compared to people that are 40, they're not as left-wing as they should be, which is consistent with some sort of with some sort of polarization, where perhaps there is a sort of conservative subclass among which perhaps you tap into. Perhaps that is part of the popularity of your channel.
Well, that's an interesting point. Yes, it is an interesting point because I do get emails from young people, and I've met up with young people. I've met up with people before they start university. I've had emails from 18-year-olds, and they've wanted to meet up with me. They've been very keen on my channel. So yes, there are people like that.
I think you said to me when I interviewed you on my channel on the live stream that you educated your daughter at home.
Yes, that's right. I didn't send her to school.
Why was that?
I didn't see much need. I mean, I taught her to read when she was very young. So she was about 18 months old when she could read. And it didn't seem, it struck me that sending her to school would disrupt her education. There didn't seem to be any point to it.
How did you manage to fit writing all your books and so forth in with full educating your daughter?
Well, because my wife and I both work part-time, so we took it in turns, so one of us always had a child with us.
And then she managed to get into Oxford, I think you said.
She went to Oxford, yeah.
What did she study there?
PPE.
But you said she was terribly left-wing?
Yes, yeah, of course.
And this is just as a result of going there, I suppose?
Well, no, partly a reaction also because she knows I read the Daily Telegraph. I mean, it's only natural that my daughter would be left-wing and sort of fanatically so. I would have been very taken aback had she joined the Young Conservatives at Oxford.
Well, I joined the Young Conservatives when I was...
And perfectly right and proper too. I'm not passing any judgment on it. It would have been remarkably surprising to me had she done so.
I was briefly in the Labour Party though, but that was mainly so I could vote for Jeremy Corbyn to be leader and then vote for him to be leader. I wanted to help that. That for obvious reasons. Okay, so anyway, moving back then to your fascinating life story. So Sweden, you go back to the Middle East, and then you finally came back to Britain in the early 80s.
Yes.
And so and you've done all these different jobs all over the place.
Yes.
So how did your writing career start to take off?
Oh, I wrote for magazines, as I say. I mean, True Detective and so on. And I've written for newspapers.
So True Detective is writing about sort of true crime, unsolved
right,
murders, things like that?
Yes, and famous murder cases and executions. I've written a few books about executions, about capital punishment, because that's a subject of enduring interest.
What particularly fascinates you about that?
It doesn't particularly fascinate me. It's something I know about through reading, and I know that there's an interest in it because we don't execute people anymore. And the subject seems to have some sort of fascination for people.
Well, yeah, I suppose it does. I suppose the idea that society can impose the ultimate punishment, which it did, for treason, but okay, that's only really in wartime they did that, of course, and murder.
Sure.
And so you've got but as I understand it, it's quite interesting. There was a weird, towards the, was it 62 they got rid of it? 62?
Last execution was 64.
64. Yeah, it was two at the same time, wasn't it?
That's right.
So 64 they got rid of it. They got rid of it for women a bit before, I think, and then they got
rid of it. Ruth Ellis was the last person hanged in 54.
54.
Yeah.
And so, but there was almost a randomness to it. So some people, they're found guilty of murder, they're executed, and then other people weren't. Wasn't that right? There was some weird...
Yeah, but there was a Homicide Act in the 50s. It meant that the death penalty was abolished generally for murder. You could poison someone and you wouldn't face a death penalty, but hanging was reserved for murder in the furtherance of theft, murder of a police officer during the execution of his duties, that sort of thing.
Oh, right. I didn't...
It was an official thing. It was the law.
So killing a police officer
would get you the death penalty. Poisoning someone or stabbing them to death wouldn't.
Killing someone during an armed robbery,
death penalty. Yep. Murder. Yeah, certainly. Murder in the furtherance of theft.
Normal murder.
Normal murder, not.
No. That is strange.
And then there was the reprieve system as well, because even when people had been sentenced to death, the Home Secretary could reprieve them and change the penalty to life imprisonment.
What was there frequently a reprieve?
Yeah, very often, because I mean the death penalty was dying out when it was abolished in '64. I think in '63, 4 or 5 people were hanged. The James Hanratty case was one of them, and it was on its way out anyway.
Why do you think as a society? Because it was popular, though, wasn't it? People right up into the 80s and 90s.
Hugely popular. Yeah.
So why did they get rid of it then?
We don't always give people what they want, do they? If you had a referendum today, I'm sure that people would vote to have it returned.
Yeah, so what do you think it says about us as what sort of a highly elitist society, I suppose, that you have this, the elite are just much more left-wing than ordinary people, or what?
Well, I think it's that we don't always give people, or governments don't always give people what they want. If you were to ask people what they want, they'd want cheap beer and hanging and all sorts of things. It's not necessarily a good thing, is it?
Oh, no, not necessarily, no. But, I mean, there were miscarriages of justice, that's for sure.
Yeah, people were hanged that were innocent.
I mean, there was that guy, what was it?
Timothy Evans.
Yeah, something Place.
Christie, yes, Whittington Place.
And he was completely innocent.
Well, he was pardoned posthumously in 1966, yes.
But it was his landlord who was...
Christie was strangling women, yeah. And Timothy Evans' wife and baby was strangled, so...
Yes, what was it? Geraldine, that was the name of the baby.
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah.
And an appalling case, and he went to the gallows, and then it turns out it was this other chap all along. So it's a bit of a problem. But I suppose it would mean that juries were less likely to convict people on murder. They'd want a lot of proof because they'd know that if you go to the gallows.
Sure, it was exactly the same in the 18th century under the Bloody Code. You know, at one time there were over 300 offences that could get you hanged in Britain. Even things like picking pockets, you know, above the value of a shilling and so on. And juries used to bring in verdicts. You know, if someone had obviously stolen more than a shilling, they were reluctant to convict and give them the death penalty. So they were bringing in a verdict saying that he'd only stolen 11pence or something, which would mean that the person wouldn't be hanged.
Yeah, okay.
So juries do that.
Yeah. So you started writing for magazines anyway.
Yeah.
True crime. We're back in the mid '80s. I don't know what magazines there were about.
Yeah.
Hit with the History Today.
No, prediction, mainly fringe things. The Lady I used to write for.
What did you do for a living then?
Well, I ran toy libraries. I ran mother and baby groups, support groups for children.
You ran a library?
Toy library.
What's that?
It's where you lend toys to children, to babies, to mothers.
I'm not familiar with this.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't even know if they're a thing now. But, I mean, I worked with children and I did writing and I taught my daughter. So.
Okay, and so what was your first book?
Oh, gosh. Maybe Life in Rome and London.
And when was that?
Not that long ago, 15, 20 years ago.
20 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah, for older people, chaps, 20 years ago is not that long ago. But and even for me, I feel that 20 years ago...
But for doddering old fossils, it goes by in the blink of an eye.
It's nothing.
It's nothing at all. It's
only 20 years ago. It's only 20 years ago. My neighbour once said that her husband had recently redecorated the bathroom. She was in her 80s. I said, well, what do you mean recently? When? Because we want to redecorate this. We had this shared upstairs loo in this house in Finland. And she said, 86, 1986. And that was recently. And that was talking to her about 2014. Recently. That's not, what are you talking about? I said, yeah, recently. She said, recently. Okay, if you say so. It looks quite old.
But of course, that is a function of age. When you're a young person, when you're a child, the time between one birthday and another, the time between your 9th birthday and the 10th birthday is an absolute eternity. And the time between one Christmas and another. But you must have noticed yourself, as you get older, Christmas seems to come around more and more quickly.
Yeah, I can't believe it's October. I can't believe it's October because it's sunny. And I'm hot, and the weather here at the moment, chaps, is absolutely extraordinary. It's about 20 degrees outside, and it's October. But I also can't believe that 2023, that the year 2000 was such a string of zeros, like your channel.
Sure.
It's such a turning point, and we went on and on about it, and there's going to be Y2K bug, and everything's going to just collapse into hell, and all this. And that was 23 years ago.
And it's nearly a quarter of a century ago. That's absolutely correct.
And if I think of like the year 2000 back to 1977, well, that's a massive period of time. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's the era of black and white TV, 1977. I mean, that's massive change. But for some reason, the year 2000, nothing's allowed to happen after that. That's the turning point. I can't get used to that. But how did you manage? So you pitched them. You had these different ideas for books. Why was it you wanted to focus on ancient Rome?
Because it's a subject I know a great deal about.
Yes, but presumably you know about it because you're really interested in it, doesn't
Yes, that's right.
So
yes,
what is it that interests you about it so much?
Well, it's more that it's the history of London, Roman London. I've got another book on Roman London coming out the end of November, Exploring Roman London, which is a guidebook to the Roman remains, every Roman remain in London that can be seen. Mm-hmm. So that will come out. I'm interested in London, so the history of London. What I'm currently working on is prehistoric London. That's London before there was a city.
So round here,
yes,
let's say you haven't come here before.
No,
Barnes we're in.
Yeah.
Do you find yourself a sort of what word can I use for it? A sort of psycho-historical analysis of the area? Do you start?
Yes, I'm always on the lookout. Yeah. That's absolutely right. Because I'm constantly on the lookout, and I'm constantly putting together sentences in my mind, and so it's a permanent process. When I'm writing, I don't sit down, and writing is something I do sort of, it's not some separate activity. If you write, I mean, you've written books yourself, you must know that writing is a skill like doing carpentry or something, or being a plumber. You can fit together ready-made pieces. You don't have to make every piece separately. You must put together sentences, and you probably have phrases that you might, if you reread your books, you'll say, "Crikey, how's that happened? I've used almost exactly the same sentence in both those books." Yes,
I have noticed this. and it's been drawn to my attention.
Absolutely, yes, yes. People have pointed it out to me as well. It's something that happens when you're. I won't say a hack. I mean, I am a hack writer. There's no two ways about that. But it's something that happens because writing is not. To me, it's a way of making a living. It's not some high-flowing activity. It's not like an artist. Some artists are driven to paint. They're racked, they're tortured, they're tormented. It doesn't matter. They can live.
It's not like poetry. There's no bloody money in poetry.
There's no money in poetry. I couldn't be bothered with it. But writing, to me, is a way of making a living. It's just like being a carpenter. And if you can, if you're a carpenter, you can make a chair, you can make a table, you can make a skirting board, you can fix things. That's what I feel like as a writer.
Yeah. So, but when you say sentences come into your head as you're walking around
I
here,
put them together in my head. Yeah, exactly.
No, but you mean you're walking around, you're just thinking about possible new books? I mean, what is it that's inspiring these sentences in the surroundings of Barnes?
Well, for example, I passed the Barnes Brewery on the road here, and that was built, there's a thing on there saying 1969. Well, there's an interesting reflection because this breweries are out in this country now. There used to be breweries all over the place because there were so many pubs and people were drinking lots of beer. That's all going now. There was a power station I passed as well, which used to function on coal. That's something else which is going because that's not the way we generate electricity now. There's loads of thoughts and loads of ideas there just waiting to be plucked out of the air, as it were, and fitted together.
Fitted together into a further history of London, or
either a history of London or an idea about how society changes or about modern ecological ideas.
Yeah.
Those ideas can be fitted in anywhere. I could do something about the green movement and I could easily fit in what I was thinking about the power station. Or if I were talking about 19th century London, bingo, the brewery's there. I can mention that.
Yes, exactly. I was in Clacton yesterday.
Yeah.
And you were noticing it was these old faded signs from when this was the glory days of Clacton.
That's right.
Which would have been up into the 50s, I suppose.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit later. And there was all this evidence of where there have been, let's say, some sort of, I think there was one, it clearly been some sort of larger, sort of Marks and Spencer's type thing, but in the local area, some sort of significant closed down, or old advertisements for things that were peeling off, and you could see the guest houses, they all peeled off, they all shut down. You can just see the slow death of this town, with no rejuvenation. It's a time warp, absolute time warp. And you can, I suppose, see elements of it here. Are you thinking of doing something on the Green Movement, a history of the Green Movement? Or?
I might well do a video about it at some point. But you see, when you were walking around Clacton, you could easily have done something about immigration. You could have said, can it be that all the asylum seekers in the hotels are working to rejuvenate this area? It's so run down, it's on its uppers. But in some areas, the hotels now are enjoying a new lease of life because the Home Office is block booking them. Will that have an effect? Will that do something for the neighbourhood? There's loads of things like that if your mind, I'd say if your mind is active, I'm sure your mind is active, but I'm constantly thinking about ideas like that and running them past, things in my mind and trying them out, if you see what I mean.
This is why you wanted to go for a walk.
Absolutely.
When I ran into you and said you want to go to the pub.
I thought, no, not the pub. I know about pubs. There's nothing there to inspire me.
Well, I didn't know you didn't drink, so I would have said, well, what are you having?
Oh.
And you would have presumably said Diet Coke or something.
Yes, or a glass of water.
A glass of water, and I would have then felt bad about having a beer, so I wouldn't have had a beer.
And it would just be social embarrassment all round.
The whole thing would have degenerated, and then there would have been tension in the room, which we don't want, which we haven't had. So anyway, but then you went from ancient history, and then you there moved into one of the books that particularly interested me. I've read a number of your books. Which was the first one I read. Goodness me, was it the slave trade one? There's a number of them I have read. That was the one I really liked. The Suffragettes.
Oh yes, yeah.
That was the one I. No, that's the. Yeah, I know. Let me move on to that. Actually, I know I talked about it when you were on my channel, but that was the idea. How have we got to this point where we're saying that Pankhurst campaign for votes for women? We have votes for women because of Pankhurst and their ilk, because of the Women's Social and Political Union, and that's rubbish.
It is
nonsense, crap.
Yeah,
they did not want votes for women.
No,
and it seems to me quite amazing that's what I was taught at school.
Sure.
Pankhurst, Emmeline Pankhurst, Sylvia Pankhurst votes.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how is this insane? It's insane
because it's neat. Because we like to see history as being a neat thing. In reality, history, what happens in the world is very messy and complicated, and we can never quite figure out what causes this or how this works. So we construct myths, we construct legends, and we fit them together so that they become coherent, and one thing follows another. And the Pankhursts are good for that. You fit them in. Oh, look, here's a woman threw herself under a horse, and that did this, and then the Pankhurst did the other. Hey, presto, it's a neat narrative.
There was a film about this with this Carrie Mulligan woman.
That's it.
And with Helena Bonham Carter.
Yeah, it was wholly misleading.
And I was like, what? You've got a working class woman who's working in a factory or something.
Yeah.
And she gets involved in the Women's Social and Political Union. And then she goes and sees Emmeline Pankhurst speak, and who's played by Meryl Streep, as I recall.
Yeah.
And she's inspired, and she gets involved.
Yeah.
And it's complete balls.
Of course it is. But very popular. A lot of people.
And the only thing that I think they got right was they portrayed, what's her name, Davison? Emily Davison, was that her name?
Yeah.
Was it Davison? That they portrayed her as a complete sort of almost like a cold psychopath.
Yeah.
And that was right. I mean, didn't you say in your book that she beat somebody up at Aberdeen Railway Station?
Yeah, she thought it was a vicar. She thought that it might be Lloyd George. So she attacked him and started beating him round the head with a stick. Caused terrible injuries too.
And they would smash stuff up. They would,
yeah.
And then interestingly, you then noted, as I recall, that quite a lot of these, well, quite a lot, but a proportion of these women that were in the WSP, A, they became fervently pro-World War One.
Yeah.
And B, some of them joined the British Union of Fascists.
That's right, yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that? How did you discover, did you know this before? Did you uncover this? Or this?
No, it's hiding in plain sight. But fanatics are easy to convert from one form of fanaticism to another. It's different. If you've got someone that's fanatically in favour of, say, or opposed to vivisection, it's easy to convert that person into being fanatically in favour of something else. You know, if you've got a rabid... I don't know if you've had any dealings with converts, say, to Catholicism or converts.
Many.
Right, okay. You will know
My first book was about this.
Oh, right. They're all a bit loopy. Yeah. I've never yet met a convert to Catholicism or Judaism that wasn't a bit funny
or anything. There's a specific psychology to the convert.
Yeah,
people that are religious, just religious people.
Yeah.
That's associated with, in personality terms, with being what's called high in agreeableness, high in conscientiousness, low in neuroticism, i.e. mentally stable. Yeah. That's religious people. Converts, low in agreeableness, low in conscientiousness, high in neuroticism. Yep. It's completely different psychology.
That's absolutely correct. And you see the difference if you meet a cradle Catholic. They're normal people, they'll go to church, that's fine, you can get on with them. You meet a Catholic convert and it's like nothing at all. My wife, as I say, was a convert to Orthodox Judaism, and sort of, I've had dealings with quite a few converts.
Did my description, personality-wise, there resonate with regard to Mrs.
I hardly
Webb?
like to say because she's still around. I don't have much dealings with her, but that's what it was with the suffragettes. The people there were converts to the cause of women's, votes for women, and then they went on to be converts to the cause of British patriotism, and then a lot of them were fanatical anti-vivisectionists, and it was easy in the 20s for them to switch over to fascism.
Yeah, some of them's communism, though, as I recall.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's almost like
Adele Pankhurst. Yeah,
but it's almost like there was one in Australia, wasn't there?
And that was Adele. Yeah. She started out as a communist, and then she ended up being interned because she was a fascist. She was a Hitler sympathiser.
Yeah, and so you've got a certain kind of personality, a certain kind of person, which is attracted to something that is black and white, that is extreme, that seems to give you perhaps some kind of sense of moral superiority.
That's right.
Which makes up for their own insecurities about themselves.
And it gives you an identity. You are somebody. You belong to something bigger than yourself. It's great. It's really attractive.
And that's what we go back to what we were talking about earlier. That's what with the woke extremists, with the cancellers, but also with, I think, on the other side, with the people on the extreme conservative. It's the same. It's this psychology of just utter intolerance of any nuance.
Yes.
And it's those kinds of people that I suppose will rewrite history in a sort of in a light which causes lies to be simplicity to be perpetuated. And you had the book on, and the other one, of course, was the slave trade.
Yeah.
Now, again, can you say about that what we're told is it's unutterably evil. And we should all feel terribly ashamed as British people that via some sort of hereditary guilt, I get the impression, even though apparently you can't have hereditary nationality, but anyway, you can have hereditary guilt. But it's more nuanced than that, you found.
Yes, it's a peculiar business because until, say 30 years ago, nobody even considered the slave trade. It was in the past, it was forgotten, it was just, it was an unfortunate thing that happened. But it's been revived. It's almost like a defining feature now. It's a leitmotif of society. And, of course, there's money in it as well, which is always, when something happens, you always ask yourself, cui bono, who benefits from this thing? And there's an awful lot of money to be had now from the slave trade, from Black Lives Matter. It's a bit of a racket. The Caribbean countries are looking now to get huge amounts of compensation. In America, black people, African Americans, stand to profit enormously from it.
Is there something historically peculiar just about European people, or Northern European people, English people even, that we get sucked in by this? Because the Italians don't seem to have this sense of self-flagellating guilt. Is it a reflection? What on earth is it about? You've done all these books about the history of England and different aspects of the history of England. What on earth is it about the English that means that we are so prone to being made to feel guilty and acting accordingly?
Ask yourself this. If you travel on a tube train and try this out, try treading on an Englishman's foot. Do you know what the Englishman will say?
Yes, of course.
You'll say sorry. You'll apologise.
Yes. But that's a sort of social code, though, isn't it? I mean, that's like how in America they'll say, "Oh, have a nice day." They don't really mean for you to have a nice day. It's just something that one does in those circumstances because that's just what one does. And it's the same way that if someone knocks into you, they'll go, "Sorry, I'm sorry." It's just a code.
Possibly, or it may tell us something deeper about English people. I don't know. I've tried the experiment on tube trains. I've deliberately trod on people's feet just to see what happened. But I'm very careful about who I've done this with in the experiment. I can think of some communities where I would be at risk if I went out of my way to tread on someone's foot on purpose. But you're safe enough doing it with an English person. The English is self-effacing. It's modesty. It's a shrinkingness that we always seem to have.
Well, how does that shrinkingness help us to once upon not that very long ago have a third of the globe under our thrall and say that it's the white man's burden, Kipling?
You might well ask, yes, how things have changed since then and why.
What, weren't we self-effacing then?
Yes, there was an English. It was supposed to be an English thing, not to boast, not to appear too clever. In some countries, if you call someone clever, it's a compliment. It's not in England. If an English person says, "Oh, he's clever," there's an implied "but." He's very clever, but
He's too clever by half.
yes, too clever for his own good. Yeah.
And there's a weird. It's funny, like living in Finland. I don't know if you noticed this in Sweden, but there is a tremendous part of your social status is how educated you are.
Yeah,
so the fact that someone has a PhD, let's say,
Yeah.
is very much looked up to. That it's considered they should basically be paid more because
Sure.
they have one. It's big part of social status. And here, if a prime minister, let's say, which Gordon Brown did, and I don't know if he was I don't know if Wilson did. I know Gordon Brown had a doctorate, but you don't go on about it. You don't call yourself Dr. Gordon Brown.
No,
That's totally, you just don't know. That's too clever by half. That's this weird. It's a strange thing that we don't, almost Philistinism, that we don't value. We think that education is something for a certain kind of person who is not quite right in the head.
well, that's quite right. And yet that's changed a little bit because, particularly females with PhDs now, it's a big thing. They call themselves doctor. No one in Britain ever used to call themselves doctor unless they were a doctor of medicine. You might perhaps in some university say it's Dr. Smith, but in real life people didn't use the title doctor unless they were actually a physician. And yet an awful lot of women now are particularly keen on being known as Dr. Smith and Dr. So-and-so.
Well, I suppose what we could mean that why women are more socially anxious, they're more insecure, they have this, what's it called, this imposter syndrome, know, so it reassures them that they've achieved something. They're more conscientious, credentialist, I think. That's another point, actually. We talked about your book on the suffragettes. One thing that I think would be interesting to look at, I don't know if you'd ever look at it, but would be what the rise of female power has done to what we were talking about right at the beginning, which is the degree to which you can have a discussion of anything you like.
Sure.
Because men and women differ in that way. Women are much more concerned that people aren't offended, that everyone feels validated, that no one's... Even if you look at how good boys and girls play games.
Yeah, they seek consensus.
Right, they seek consensus. Yes. Boys will play a competitive game and someone wins. Yeah. Girls will play a game where everyone okay, everyone fits in.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that they take over and have taken over the universities, particularly things like history departments.
Of course.
And then what do they turn it into? It's a giant nursery school, basically, which is what they are evolved to really be doing at that kind of age, which is running a nursery. So what does this do to society, do you think? Your lifetime, we've gone from a situation where basically all the judges are men, most of the academics are men, to lots of women judges now, and lots and lots of women academics. What does this do to a country?
Well, it innovates a country and it prevents new ideas from coming out. Because when men have a discourse together, it's a process, it's a dialectical process. One man will put forward an idea, his thesis, and then someone else, his male opponent, comes up with an antithesis, and they will argue together, furiously defending their positions, each of them, and from that can emerge a synthesis, a new idea which incorporates the best of both the thesis and the antithesis. That's a dialectical process. That doesn't happen if you're seeking consensus. If you have two women, rather than that opposition, they will be looking from the start for compromise. They'll be looking for ways that they can avoid that confrontation. If you see two men arguing a point, it can become quite furious. Men will raise their voices and they won't give an inch. They're each forcing to get their opinion, their view taken as to get the other person to concede. It's almost like a fight, an intellectual fight. You don't get that with women, which means that new ideas tend not to be generated.
And there is this concern with them about offence and feelings.
That's right.
And this concept, I hate this concept of something being mean.
Yeah.
And not mean in the sense that it meant in the 16th century, poor. Mean in this new sense, manipulative sense of unkind.
Yes.
And I didn't know about this, but when they brought women into Oxford University, which they did it might have been the late 1890s or about 1900, and they brought them in for a while, and then there was this backlash against it, where the students eventually insisted that no more than 1 in 7 of the undergraduates should be women. And the justification for this was them saying, well, it's ruining the collegiate atmosphere. It's ruining the ability, and by that they didn't mean collegiate as in everyone getting along.
No.
But it's ruining this situation where in the old days, in our seminars or whatever, we could discuss rigorously all points of view, and now we can't do that because, and they had noticed it, because these girls tend to get upset and whatever. It happened to me the other day at Oxford University. I was there, I was interviewing these students, I was asking them about, should you be allowed to debate controversial issues? They were thoughtfully talking about it. Should you be allowed to debate this issue? I mean, talking about race, you see. And then everything was fine, except there was one female who reacted, oh, well, this is, I'm not comfortable with it, this is eugenics. And then another female came along, oh, what are you, a eugenicist? And then it just got out of, and eventually security was called. Eventually the librarian came out, she was wearing a rainbow thing, and wanted to talk to me, and I said, no, I'm not going to talk to you, I'm talking to the camera. And then they called security, and then these two burly security guards stood there, and I asked them, what's going on? Have I done anything against the law? No. Have I done anything wrong? No. But complaints have been made. And one of the things I'd done as part of it was I'd just to illustrate a point about reasonable intelligence, I said, can I measure your skull with these calipers? Because they used to do that in the old days, you see. And they were like, yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, quite a big head. That's how it works. 0.3 correlation. And then they said, and then the security guard said, yeah, the thing is, 3 people have complained that someone was outside measuring people's skulls, and this made them feel, unsafe. So. And it broke down just because of 1 or 2 women.
Yes. However, you must have known that when you did that this was going to end badly, I would have thought.
I thought it might.
You thought it might?
I thought it might. I thought it might. But I didn't think it would. But it wasn't the caliper measuring that actually provoked them originally. It wasn't that. It was the question. That was an extra thing. That was the excuse she used to go and complain, because she thought that was the most dramatic thing I was doing, I guess. But it was that I suggested to her basically that opinions she didn't agree with for emotional reasons, can they be discussed here? And then I gave that example, and then that said to her, oh, you're not part of my gang. You're not. And I feel
what college was this?
And this was outside the Radcliffe, outside the Bodleian Library.
Okay.
Yeah. The girl in question was at St Anne's College. But yeah, and men, no problem. Most women. I mean, it's just this. All it takes. That's the thing. It's an outlier. Women, as a group, you get lots of women that are very intelligent and very able to discuss things and debate things. But there is this average that's a bit different. What that means is, at the extreme, you have a problem. So finally, we began with this idea of why is it that the old man, everyone's elderly cantankerous uncle, has managed to produce such a popular channel that they like watching. So how do you see things from what you've seen so far in your longish life developing over the next couple of decades in this country?
I couldn't possibly predict that. It's fatal. Whatever I said on that subject is sure to be proved wrong.
Do you have any instincts that you sort of... Do you think it's going to get worse, or do you think there's going to be a reaction against it? Because as it happens throughout history, you get these reactions.
I think we might be on the verge of catastrophic trouble in the world, which really would change everything. I think personally we might be on the verge of a world war. And when that happens, everything changes anyway. You think about the First World War and the Jazz Age after, and the Second World War and so on. I think that perhaps there will be a very large-scale conflict, and that's bound to alter everything, which will mean that all bets are off when you're making predictions.
I suppose so. I mean, really, there tends to be a mega war every sort of 80 years.
Yeah, that's right.
So we're due one.
We are well overdue a world war.
We should have had one about 10 years ago, really.
Yeah, that's right.
So I guess our enormous wealth, is putting it off, is postponing it, perhaps.
Yes, but I think it might well be coming. I mean, you obviously know that the Second World War didn't actually start in 1939. It wasn't that people got up one morning in August or September and said, oh, look, there's a world war starting. You had the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the Italians in Abyssinia and so on. It's the same thing here. We've seen all these small wars, and I think it's possible that we're heading for a large war.
I get the impression from reading about the time that everybody was aware. It wasn't a surprise.
No, not a bit of it.
A war was coming. It was coming.
Yeah, of course.
And even also before, some people have argued, a guy interviewed once called Godfrey Bloom, who used to be a UKIP MEP, and he argued, well, no, there's no First and Second World War. It's basically one war.
Sure.
With a bit of a break in between. But go back to the summer of 1914 or even before, there was this awareness it was coming.
Yeah.
These tensions, and all it took was a spark, which was the shooting of the Archduke by Gabriel Princip, was that his name? And then off it went. So presumably there's a spark. Could that have happened? Could that be Israel?
I think we have had the spark, yeah. I think it's quite possible, and that things are going to go downhill.
And the spark was this?
Yeah.
Last week?
Yeah.
The other day. Well, on that happy note, I think it's been a jolly interesting conversation, and I'd like to thank Simon for coming along. And Simon, are you working on a book? What was the book you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, Prehistoric London. The history of this area, the area that will one day become London.
So that should be interesting if your psychogeography spectacles on when you're walking around London and you can see evidence of presumably you can, of prehistoric London in the undulations of the...
Yes, indeed.
And so that we look forward to that, and I will see you all soon, and goodbye. Are you ready for the future of the West?